The airplane cabin was buzzing with the normal sound of people preparing for a long flight. The air smelled faintly of coffee, leather seats, and that usual mix of perfume and travel. People were arranging bags in the overhead compartments, adjusting their seat belts, and settling in with their books or phones. In the middle of all this, a tall black man in a crisp shirt and neat trousers quietly walked to his assigned seat near the window. He looked calm, almost like someone who was used to long journeys. His steps were steady, and his eyes carried a sense of peace, as if nothing around him could disturb his balance. He placed his small carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, smiled politely at the flight attendant who greeted him, and sat down without making any noise. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The passengers around him were busy with their own things. A businessman flipped through the pages of a financial magazine. A mother adjusted the blanket for her little girl. A young couple whispered to each other with excitement about their upcoming trip. The man quietly sat, gazing outside the window, watching the airport staff move around on the tarmac. Then, the quietness broke. A woman approached the same row, and the moment she saw him sitting there, her face changed. She was a middle-aged white woman, dressed elegantly, with her handbag hanging from her arm and her sunglasses perched on her head. She paused in front of the row, staring at the man with disbelief. Her lips pressed tightly together, and she let out a small, sharp breath. She then turned toward the flight attendant who was nearby and pointed at the man as if something was wrong. "This can't be right," she said firmly, shaking her head. Her voice was loud enough that people in the surrounding seats looked up. "Are you sure this is first class? I don't think he belongs here." The flight attendant, a young woman with kind eyes, blinked in confusion. "Ma'am, this is his assigned seat. Could I please help you find yours?" she asked in her polite, professional tone. But the woman didn't calm down. She tilted her head, clearly annoyed. No, I think there must be a mistake. I paid for first class. I don't want to sit here. Please, put him somewhere else." Her words, though said in a controlled voice, carried an edge that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. The black man didn't say anything. He just looked straight ahead, his face calm, as though he had heard such things before and had trained himself not to react. His hands rested gently on his lap, and his posture stayed straight and composed. He didn't even glance at the woman, which somehow made her even more frustrated. Around them, passengers began whispering. A man in the row behind leaned slightly forward, eyebrows raised, watching what was happening. A young woman across the aisle quickly unlocked her phone camera, sensing the tension and beginning to record. Others exchanged looks with one another, unsure of whether to speak up or stay silent. The woman put her handbag down on her seat and turned back to the flight attendant. "Look, I've flown on this airline many times. I always sit in first class. You need to move him to coach. This is not acceptable." Her words hung heavy in the air, like a shadow passing through the cabin. The flight attendant glanced nervously at the man, then back at the woman. She tried to explain again, gently, that every passenger had been assigned their seat fairly. "Ma'am, this is his rightful seat. Everything is correct. You're also in first class, so there is no issue." But the woman crossed her arms, clearly unhappy. Her voice grew sharper. "I shouldn't have to sit next to someone who doesn't belong here." The passengers nearby felt the sting of her words. Some shook their heads quietly, others kept staring at their screens, pretending not to hear. But the discomfort was visible in their eyes. The black man still did not move. His chest rose and fell slowly as he took in a calm breath. He didn't argue, didn't frown, and didn't answer. His silence was powerful in its own way, as if he had chosen not to lower himself to her words. The woman sighed loudly, making sure everyone could hear her displeasure. She pulled out her phone and scrolled with exaggerated movements, as though trying to show how inconvenienced she was. The flight attendant, clearly unsettled, excused herself for a moment, perhaps to talk with her colleagues about how to handle the situation. The man remained seated, his eyes drifting back to the window. Outside, he could see ground staff signaling to each other, fueling trucks moving away from the plane, and luggage carts being loaded. It was almost as if he was choosing to focus on that calm scene instead of the chaos beside him. After a few moments, another flight attendant approached to assist. He was older, with a confident posture. He politely asked the woman what the problem was, and she repeated her complaint, this time louder, making sure more passengers could hear. I paid good money for this seat. I should not have to sit next to him. Move him. Find another seat for me, or for him. The older flight attendant gave a small smile, nodding slowly, but his eyes revealed discomfort. He didn't argue with her directly, but he also didn't agree. He simply said he would look into the matter. Passengers were now fully engaged, some pretending to be reading while their ears remained alert. The air in the cabin felt tense, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The woman's voice had carried far, and though many were bothered by it, they hesitated to intervene. Nobody wanted to cause further drama before takeoff. Still, the man's composure impressed them. While being openly challenged, while being humiliated in front of strangers, he remained steady. His silence spoke louder than words. It was almost as if he knew something others didn't, something that would soon change the entire mood of the flight. The engines outside began to rumble softly, signaling that the flight would soon be ready to take off. Inside, however, all eyes were locked on the small drama unfolding in the row. A simple journey had suddenly turned into a test of dignity, patience, and truth. What no one realized yet was that the man who sat quietly at the window seat was far more important, and far more remarkable, than anyone could have imagined. The plane had not yet left the ground, but the air inside the cabin already felt heavy with tension. The woman's sharp words still lingered, echoing in the minds of those who had overheard her. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended to stay busy with their phones or magazines, though their eyes kept flicking back to the row where the scene was unfolding. The black man sat quietly, his gaze steady and calm. His silence stood in contrast to the woman's constant sighs and complaints. Every now and then, she would adjust her bag with a loud snap of the zipper or clear her throat in a dramatic way, as if she wanted the entire cabin to feel her discomfort. Yet the man did not move, nor did he respond. He kept his posture upright, his hands resting loosely on his lap. It was clear to anyone watching that he had chosen a path of patience, perhaps even dignity, instead of conflict. The younger flight attendant returned, her smile polite but a little strained. She crouched down beside the woman and spoke in a low, careful tone, "Ma'am, I do understand your concern, but this passenger is in the correct seat. Everything is in order." The woman's voice, however, rose again, slicing through the air. "I paid a lot of money for first class," she said firmly. "And I will not sit here feeling uncomfortable. Move him, or move me." Several passengers' eyes widened at her words. A man across the aisle muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. A young girl sitting 2 rows behind tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why is she so mad?" The mother, embarrassed, quickly hushed her child and avoided looking forward. The black man still didn't react. If anything, his stillness drew more attention than her outbursts. He didn't frown, didn't flinch, and didn't even sigh. It was as if he had chosen to carry an invisible shield that her words could not pierce. The older flight attendant returned, standing tall this time. He addressed both the woman and the man with equal politeness. "We are moments away from departure," he said. "I ask that all passengers remain seated. This gentleman has every right to his seat, just as you do. Please, let's continue calmly." The woman, however, leaned back and folded her arms tightly across her chest. "This is not fair," she murmured, but loudly enough for those nearby to hear. Somewhere in the cabin, a phone camera light blinked. A passenger was discreetly recording, capturing every moment of the exchange. Others pretended not to notice but kept watching closely, feeling the weight of what was happening. The man finally spoke, his voice soft but clear. "I am comfortable where I am," he said simply, without looking at the woman. His tone was calm, without anger, almost as if he were stating a fact rather than defending himself. The words carried across the cabin, and some passengers shifted again, recognizing the quiet strength behind them. The woman seemed frustrated that he hadn't argued with her. She tapped her foot impatiently, as though waiting for someone to take her side. But no one did. The businessman with the financial magazine glanced at her, then quickly turned back to his pages. The young couple whispered to each other again, shaking their heads. The silence of those around her only made her fidget more. The plane's engines began to hum louder, signaling that takeoff was near. The flight attendants quickly moved down the aisle to check seat belts and storage compartments, but the air of discomfort had not lifted. Everyone knew something unusual was happening, and they were waiting to see how it would unfold. As the plane taxied slowly across the runway, the woman leaned toward the flight attendant once more. "I am telling you, this isn't right. People should be seated with their own kind. How hard is it to understand that?" Gasps filled the air. This time, her words were sharp enough to sting every ear. Even those who had tried to stay quiet could no longer pretend not to hear. A man a few rows ahead turned and looked back, his face stern. A young woman whispered, "Unbelievable," to the person beside her. Phones were now being held slightly higher, cameras capturing the heated moment. Still, the black man sat in silence. His composure seemed unbreakable, like a steady rock against crashing waves. He closed his eyes briefly, took a slow breath, and then opened them again, gazing once more out of the window at the sky that was waiting beyond. The flight attendant stiffened but didn't respond to the woman's comment. She simply nodded and walked away, perhaps to keep from escalating the situation further. The older attendant gave the woman a firm look before continuing down the aisle. It was clear the crew was doing their best to remain professional while under pressure. Takeoff came, and the plane soared into the clouds. The roar of the engines filled the cabin, but even as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, the tension had not disappeared. The woman pulled out her phone, scrolling noisily, her jaw tight with irritation. The man, however, opened a small notebook and began writing something, his pen moving smoothly across the page. His actions carried a sense of calm so powerful that a few passengers couldn't stop glancing his way. The whispers among the passengers grew. "He's so calm," someone murmured. "Why isn't he saying anything?" asked another. "He doesn't need to," replied a third softly. The woman leaned back in her seat, clearly restless. Every now and then, she shot quick glances at the man, as if expecting him to finally snap or argue back. But he never did. His silence became heavier than her words. It made her complaints seem smaller and smaller with each passing minute. About an hour into the flight, drinks were served. When the flight attendant reached their row, she carefully placed a glass of water on the man's tray with a gentle smile. Then she turned to the woman, her smile more polite than warm, and asked what she would like. The woman ordered with a cold tone, glaring at the man as though he had somehow stolen something from her. The man thanked the attendant softly, sipped his water, and returned to his notebook. He seemed completely at peace, even in the middle of the storm swirling around him. Meanwhile, the passengers who had been recording whispered quietly, "This is going to go viral. People need to see how she treated him, and how calm he stayed." They weren't sure who the man was, but his quiet dignity impressed them deeply. As the flight continued, the woman grew quieter, though her posture remained stiff. The man, unbothered, read a few pages of a book, closed it, and then leaned back in his seat with his eyes closed. The contrast between them was striking, one consumed by bitterness, the other glowing with patience. What no one knew yet was that his silence was not weakness. It was strength. He was a man with a remarkable story, a man whose identity would soon shake the entire cabin and turn humiliation into respect. For now, though, he waited, calm as ever, letting the moments pass like clouds drifting across the sky. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane continued its journey above the clouds. The bright sunlight poured through the small oval windows, making the sky look endless and calm. But inside the cabin, not everyone felt calm. The tension from earlier still lingered in the air, like a shadow that refused to fade. Some passengers had returned to their books, movies, or headphones, but every so often their eyes would wander back to the row where the quiet black man sat beside the restless woman. She had grown quieter than before, but her body language spoke volumes. Her arms remained tightly folded, her face stiff, her jaw clenched. It was as if she was waiting for something to happen, waiting for someone to support her demands. Yet no one did. The other passengers had seen enough to know what was really happening, and their silence now was not out of agreement with her, it was out of disapproval. The black man, on the other hand, sat in his place as if nothing had happened. His stillness was almost remarkable. He leaned slightly back in his seat, his eyes closed for moments at a time, then opened them again to gaze out the window at the sky. Every now and then, he would reach for his notebook and write a few words, his hand steady, his thoughts uninterrupted. It was a picture of quiet strength that some passengers couldn't stop admiring. But the woman wasn't done. About 2 hours into the flight, she pressed the call button for the flight attendant. The soft chime echoed in the cabin, and the younger attendant approached with her usual polite smile. "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" The woman leaned forward, lowering her voice slightly but making sure it was still firm. "I told you earlier. I don't feel comfortable sitting here. I need him moved." She gestured with her hand toward the man as if he were a misplaced object rather than a fellow passenger. The flight attendant took in a slow breath, her smile faltering just a little. "Ma'am, as I mentioned before, every seat is assigned. This gentleman has the correct ticket. There are no mistakes." The woman's eyebrows arched. "You mean to say there are no empty seats in coach? Put him there. Or put me there, if you must. I just won't sit here another hour." Her voice rose again, enough for others to hear. Passengers across the aisle looked up, their expressions tightening. A man in a business suit muttered, "Unbelievable," under his breath. Another passenger shook her head, adjusting her blanket. The young woman with the phone continued recording quietly, her fingers steady as she held the camera. The black man finally opened his eyes and turned slightly toward the attendant. His voice was calm, low, and steady, almost soothing in the middle of the storm. "I am fine here. There is no need to move anyone," he said. His words were simple, but they carried weight. The tone was not defensive, nor sharp, it was peaceful, as if he was determined not to let anyone drag him into anger. The passengers nearby seemed to take comfort in his presence, as though his composure gave them courage too. The woman scoffed loudly. "You see? He thinks he can just stay here like nothing happened. I'm telling you, this isn't right. I don't know why you're letting this go on." The flight attendant, keeping her professional stance, gave the woman a firm but respectful reply. "Ma'am, everyone here deserves respect. Please, let's continue the flight peacefully." With that, she excused herself, leaving the woman fuming in her seat. The black man quietly returned to his notebook, his pen gliding over the paper. He didn't even glance at her. His silence was louder than any argument could have been. The cabin grew quieter again, but the whispers spread. "He's handling this so well," said one passenger softly. Better than I could, another replied. She just doesn't know who she's dealing with, a third added knowingly, though they too had no idea how right those words would turn out to be. As the hours passed, the atmosphere began to shift. More passengers seemed to notice the man's calm presence. Some even nodded politely when their eyes met his, as though offering silent support. The woman, however, only grew more restless. She ordered another drink, her fingers tapping rapidly on her phone screen, her shoulders tense. It was clear she was not going to let go of her frustration easily. Then came a small turning point. As the plane hit a patch of light turbulence, the overhead lights flickered, and the seat belt sign chimed. The passengers tightened their belts, and a nervous hush filled the cabin. The woman let out a sharp gasp, clutching the armrest. For the first time, her confidence seemed to falter. The man beside her, steady as ever, gently said, "It's just turbulence. Nothing to worry about." The irony was not lost on the passengers around them. The very man she had tried to humiliate now offered her comfort. She turned to look at him, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to reply, but no words came. She looked away quickly, embarrassed, while he simply leaned back again, unaffected. The turbulence passed within minutes, but the small moment stayed with everyone who had seen it. The man's calmness wasn't just about ignoring insults, it was about carrying himself with grace in every situation. Still, the tension wasn't over. The woman pressed the call button one more time, demanding to speak with the head attendant or the captain if necessary. The older attendant returned, this time more serious. He knelt slightly to her level and said firmly, "Ma'am, I understand you're unhappy. But there will be no changes. Every passenger here has a right to be in their seat. Please, I ask you to remain respectful, or we will have no choice but to make a report when we land." The woman's eyes widened. She hadn't expected such firmness. She glanced around and realized every eye near her was watching. The businessman across the aisle, the young couple, the recording phone, all were witnesses. Her voice wavered slightly as she muttered, "Fine," and sank back into her seat. The man next to her didn't even look her way. He simply opened his book, flipping to the next chapter, as though nothing had happened. His calmness made the woman's anger seem small, almost powerless. Passengers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling softly at the man's composure. They didn't know who he was, but his presence carried authority, a quiet power that demanded respect without words. The hours ticked by. Dinner was served, lights dimmed, and the cabin settled into a hush. The woman barely touched her food, lost in her thoughts. The man, however, ate slowly, politely thanking the attendant, then closed his eyes once more, resting peacefully. Though the flight seemed to return to normal, the passengers knew something unusual had unfolded before their eyes. It wasn't just a disagreement between two people, it was a test of character, and only one of them had passed. What no one yet realized was that the quiet strength of the man would not remain a mystery for long. His true identity, when revealed, would turn everything upside down. The whispers, the recordings, the silent admiration, all of it was leading to a moment that would leave the woman speechless and the passengers in awe. For now, the plane sailed smoothly above the clouds, carrying with it a story that was about to shift from humiliation to revelation. The cabin lights were dimmed now, and most passengers had begun to relax into the rhythm of the long flight. Some watched movies on the small screens in front of them, others scrolled lazily through their phones, and a few closed their eyes to rest. But even in the calmer atmosphere, the memory of what had happened earlier still floated in the air. Passengers who had witnessed the uncomfortable scene could not easily forget the way the woman had spoken or the way the man had responded with steady silence. The woman sat stiffly in her seat, her arms folded and her lips pressed into a tight line. She had quieted down, but her body language still showed her annoyance. Every now and then, she would glance sideways at the man, as if she expected him to finally break his silence. But he did not. He continued to remain composed, sometimes reading, sometimes writing in his notebook, and sometimes simply staring out of the window at the wide blanket of stars outside. His calmness made her fidget even more, as though she could not understand how someone could endure her words without reaction. A few rows back, passengers whispered softly. The young woman who had been recording earlier quietly showed the video to her seatmate. "Look at him," she said in a hushed voice. "He didn't even raise his voice once." "And look at her," she kept going on. The seatmate nodded slowly, impressed. "He must be someone important," she said. "The way he sits, the way he talks, it's like he doesn't need to prove anything to anyone." It was during this quiet moment that the unexpected happened. The door to the cockpit opened, and the pilot stepped out. He was a tall man in his crisp uniform, his cap tucked under his arm. His appearance immediately drew attention, because it wasn't common for the pilot to leave the cockpit in the middle of a flight unless there was a good reason. The cabin grew silent, curious eyes following him as he walked down the aisle. The pilot stopped at the row where the black man and the woman sat. His eyes rested on the man first, and then his face broke into a wide, genuine smile. He reached out his hand respectfully. "Commander, it's an honor to have you on board," he said warmly. The passengers nearby froze, their eyes widening. Some leaned forward to hear more clearly. The woman blinked in surprise, looking back and forth between the pilot and the man sitting beside her. The man slowly closed his notebook, placed it on the tray table, and shook the pilot's hand firmly. His voice was calm and deep as he replied, "Thank you, Captain. It's good to be here." The woman's mouth opened slightly in shock. She turned toward the man, her face pale, and whispered, "Commander," as if the word itself felt foreign to her lips. The pilot straightened, his tone filled with respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the cabin, "I want to acknowledge that we are honored to have Commander James Carter on this flight with us. He has recently returned from a ceremony in Washington, where he was recognized for his extraordinary service to our country. He has led missions that have saved countless lives and brought honor to our nation. Please join me in welcoming him." The cabin erupted in applause. Passengers clapped, some even stood up slightly in their seats to get a better look at the man. The businessman across the aisle clapped the loudest, nodding with admiration. The young couple smiled brightly, joining in the applause. The mother with her little girl leaned over and whispered to her daughter, "You see? That's a real hero." The little girl's eyes grew wide with wonder. The woman beside him shrank into her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process what she had just heard. The very man she had tried to dismiss, the man she had demanded be moved, was not just any passenger. He was a decorated commander, a national hero who carried himself with dignity far greater than anyone else in the cabin. The pilot placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Commander, if you need anything at all during this flight, you just let us know. We're honored to have you with us." The man gave a polite nod and a gentle smile. "Thank you, Captain. I'm fine right here." The pilot nodded once more, then turned to the passengers and said, "We're in good hands today. Let's continue this flight with gratitude." With that, he walked back toward the cockpit, leaving the cabin buzzing with murmurs and admiration. The applause slowly faded, but the respect in the air remained. Passengers leaned toward each other, whispering words like "unbelievable," "a commander," and "I had no idea." Many of them looked at the man with new eyes, their earlier silence now replaced with awe. The woman sat frozen, her face pale and her confidence gone. She glanced around and noticed passengers looking at her, some with disappointment, others with quiet judgment. She quickly turned her face toward the window, trying to avoid their eyes. For the first time since the flight began, she had nothing to say. The man beside her remained calm, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He picked up his notebook again and quietly returned to writing, his composure unshaken by the attention. His dignity seemed even greater now, because he had never once tried to prove himself. His silence had allowed the truth to reveal itself at the right time, in the right way. Passengers continued to admire him throughout the flight. A few walked past his seat later, on their way to the restroom, and gave him polite nods or whispered, "Thank you for your service." Each time, he simply smiled and nodded back, his manner humble, never seeking praise. The woman, however, remained stiff and uncomfortable. She kept fidgeting with her handbag, adjusting her scarf, and avoiding everyone's eyes. Her earlier confidence had disappeared completely, replaced by an awkward stillness. She knew that everyone in the cabin had witnessed her words, and now they all knew exactly who she had spoken them to. The man never addressed her directly. He never reminded her of what she had said, never demanded an apology, never raised his voice to point out her mistake. His silence toward her carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. It was as if his quiet dignity itself was teaching her the lesson she needed to learn. As the hours passed and the plane continued across the night sky, the cabin slowly returned to its routine. Meals were served, lights were dimmed once more, and passengers drifted into sleep. But the story of what had happened in that cabin would not be forgotten, because it had become much more than an argument between two people. It had turned into a moment of revelation, a lesson in patience, humility, and truth. The black man who had been humiliated was not only a rightful passenger in first class, he was someone who had earned far greater respect than anyone could imagine. His quiet strength had turned humiliation into honor, and in doing so, he had shown everyone on that flight what true dignity looked like. The woman, left in silence beside him, had no choice but to sit with her thoughts. For the rest of the journey, she avoided speaking. She knew that the lesson had been delivered, not with anger or confrontation, but with truth revealed at the perfect time. And that truth was enough to change the way everyone in the cabin looked at him, at her, and perhaps even at themselves. The plane continued to glide steadily across the night sky, the hum of the engines softening into the background. Most passengers had settled back into their seats, some asleep under thin blankets, others quietly watching movies or reading. Yet there was still a certain energy in the cabin, an invisible awareness of what had just taken place. The reveal of the man's true identity had changed the entire atmosphere. Where there had once been whispers of discomfort and tension, now there was respect, admiration, and even a touch of pride that such a man was traveling among them. The woman beside him had shrunk smaller in her seat. Her once sharp words were now silent on her lips. Her arms were no longer crossed in power, but instead nervously folded, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her handbag. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Every time she tried to glance his way, she caught sight of the other passengers' faces that carried quiet judgment. And so she kept her eyes fixed on the window, though the endless darkness outside offered no comfort. The man, however, seemed unchanged. He had not sought the applause, had not basked in the attention. When the pilot had honored him, he had simply nodded, then returned to his notebook, his thoughts steady. His silence remained his strength. It was as if he carried with him a lesson far greater than any speech could deliver, that dignity does not need loud defense, and that truth has a way of revealing itself in time. Passengers continued to show their quiet admiration. A young man in a hoodie, who had looked restless earlier in the flight, leaned across the aisle and whispered, "Sir, thank you for your service." The commander gave a small smile and replied simply, "Thank you," his tone warm but humble. A woman carrying her toddler to the restroom paused briefly to smile at him, mouthing the words "God bless you" before moving on. Every small interaction carried with it the weight of respect, and the man accepted each one with grace, never making it about himself. Meanwhile, the woman sat frozen in her silence. The shame was heavier now than any turbulence could ever be. She could still hear her own words echoing in her mind, the demands, the complaints, the assumptions she had made. And now, knowing the truth, She realized how small those words sounded. The man beside her was not just any passenger, he was someone who had spent years serving others, someone who had faced challenges far greater than her discomfort in first class. Her words had not diminished him at all. If anything, they had only revealed the greatness of his patience. The flight attendants, too, treated him differently now, though with the same professionalism they showed to all. When they came to offer tea or coffee, their smiles were warmer, their voices gentler. One attendant even whispered softly, "Commander, if you need anything special, please don't hesitate." He only smiled and shook his head. "I'm fine. Thank you." Hours passed, and the plane began its slow descent toward the destination. The city lights below sparkled like stars scattered across the ground. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady, announcing their approach and thanking the passengers for flying. As the seatbelt sign lit up, the passengers prepared for landing. Yet for many, their thoughts were not on the arrival, but on the remarkable story they had just witnessed unfold in their own cabin. The young woman who had been recording glanced once more at her phone screen. She knew the video she had captured would tell a story the world needed to see. But in that moment, she hesitated. She looked at the commander and wondered if sharing it would honor him, or if perhaps the greater honor was to simply carry the memory as a personal lesson. She locked her phone, deciding that sometimes the best stories are those you carry in your heart. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels rolling across the runway with a gentle roar. Applause broke out once again, as it often does when a flight ends safely, but this time the clapping felt fuller, as if it carried more meaning. It wasn't just for the safe landing, it was for the man whose presence had transformed the entire journey. As passengers stood to collect their bags, many glanced again at the commander, their expressions filled with admiration. Some offered polite nods, others whispered thanks. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward and said quietly, "Sir, it was an honor to share this flight with you." The man smiled, replying with the same calm dignity he had shown all along. The woman, however, struggled to move. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her bag in the overhead compartment. A flight attendant stepped forward to help, but she quickly shook her head, embarrassed. She knew that every eye in the cabin remembered what she had said. The weight of that knowledge pressed on her shoulders, making even the simple act of standing feel difficult. As the passengers slowly filed out of the plane, the commander waited patiently in his seat, letting others go before him. He didn't rush, didn't push forward. When he finally stood, his posture was as steady as it had been when he first boarded. He collected his bag, adjusted his jacket, and gave a polite nod to the flight crew as he stepped into the aisle. The woman found herself directly behind him in line. For a moment, she opened her mouth, as if to speak, to offer an apology, perhaps, but no words came. Her throat felt tight, and her courage failed her. She lowered her eyes and followed quietly, her silence louder than any excuse she could have made. At the gate, as passengers stepped out into the terminal, some paused to shake the commander's hand one last time. "Thank you," they said, their voices sincere. He nodded back, offering nothing more than his warm, steady smile. To him, it was just another journey, another day of carrying himself with dignity. But to those who had witnessed the flight, it was something they would never forget. The woman walked quickly away, her steps hurried, her face pale. She carried with her the heavy lesson of the night, that respect cannot be demanded by belittling others, and that true greatness needs no announcement, it reveals itself in time. The commander, meanwhile, walked calmly through the terminal, blending into the crowd. To strangers, he was just another traveler with a small bag and a quiet stride. But to those who had shared that flight, he was far more than that. He was a reminder that dignity is stronger than anger, patience more powerful than pride, and truth always greater than prejudice. And so, the story of that flight would live on. Passengers would tell their families and friends, not just about their trip, but about the man who sat silently in his seat and turned humiliation into honor without saying a single harsh word. They would tell of the applause, of the reveal, of the lesson learned by all. For the commander, it was simply another day. But for everyone else on that plane, it was a day that reminded them of the power of respect, the strength of character, and the quiet victory of truth revealed at the right time.